My name is Sarah Chen, and I'm 28 years old. I just spent my last paycheck on a surprise flight across the Pacific Ocean to see my mother for her 65th birthday. 12 hours in economy class, cramped legs, terrible airplane food, and the excitement building in my chest as I imagined the look on her face when I showed up at her door unannounced. What I found instead were complete strangers living in what I thought was my childhood home, and a for sale sign with a bright red sold sticker plastered across it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the eldest daughter of Chinese immigrants in Seattle taught me responsibility early. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had sacrificed everything to move to America when I was just 3 years old. They left behind successful careers in Hong Kong, my father's engineering position, and my mother's work as a school principal, to give my younger brother Kevin and me opportunities they never had. The transition wasn't easy for any of us, but it was hardest on them. I watched my father take a job as a maintenance worker at a local community college while studying English at night to eventually become a certified electrician. My mother cleaned offices before dawn and took evening classes to get her teaching credentials recognized in Washington state. They never complained, never made Kevin or me feel guilty about their sacrifices, but I understood from a young age that everything they did was for us. The house on Maple Street was their first major purchase in America. I was 8 years old when we moved from our cramped two-bedroom apartment into what felt like a mansion to my young eyes. 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a small backyard where my mother immediately started a vegetable garden, and a basement that my father converted into his workshop. The mortgage payments stretched their budget thin, but my parents beamed with pride every time they talked about owning their own piece of American soil. That house became the center of our family universe. Every major holiday was celebrated in our dining room, the table extended with folding chairs borrowed from neighbors to accommodate relatives and family friends. My mother's famous dumplings were made in that kitchen every Chinese New Year. The whole family gathered around the island folding hundreds of them while sharing stories and laughs. My father built custom shelves in every room to display our family photos and my mother's growing collection of ceramic figurines. As I got older, I realized that my parents poured not just their money but their hearts into that house. My mother spent weekends painting rooms in colors she carefully selected from hardware store samples. My father upgraded the electrical system himself, installed new fixtures and built a beautiful deck in the backyard where we had barbecues every summer. Every improvement was done with their own hands, partly to save money but mostly because they wanted to make it truly theirs. Kevin, 4 years younger than me, always seemed to take our parents' sacrifices for granted in a way that frustrated me. While I helped my mother with household chores and learned to cook traditional Chinese dishes, Kevin focused on his video games and friends. When I started working part-time at 16 to help with family expenses, Kevin complained that he needed new sneakers and couldn't understand why we couldn't just buy whatever we wanted like his classmates' families. The pattern continued through high school. I maintained a 4.0 GPA while working 20 hours a week at a local grocery store, sending every paycheck directly to my parents to help with mortgage payments and household expenses. I applied for every scholarship available, wrote dozens of essays about overcoming challenges and cultural barriers, and ultimately earned a partial scholarship to study computer science at the University of Washington. College was a constant juggling act of classes, studying and work. I lived at home to save money, which meant a 2-hour daily commute on public transportation to campus. While my classmates talked about dorm life, campus parties and spring break trips, I was calculating how many hours I needed to work each week to contribute to the household and still have enough for textbooks and school supplies. My parents never asked me to work or contribute financially, but I could see the stress lines deepening around my father's eyes when he reviewed the monthly bills. I heard my mother whispering prayers in Mandarin late at night when she thought no one was listening, asking for strength to keep the family stable. The weight of being the responsible daughter, the one who understood and appreciated their sacrifices, settled on my shoulders naturally. During my sophomore year, my mother was diagnosed with high blood pressure and diabetes. The medical bills started piling up, even with insurance. Prescription medications, regular doctor visits, and dietary changes that required more expensive groceries strained the budget even further. My father started working overtime whenever possible, coming home exhausted but never complaining. I increased my work hours and took on freelance web design projects, often coding until 2 or 3 in the morning, after finishing my regular shift at the campus bookstore. My grades remained high, but my social life became non-existent. I watched my classmates form study groups and friendships while I rushed from class to work to home, barely having time for conversations beyond academic necessities. The summer before my junior year, my mother sat me down in the kitchen where we had shared so many conversations over the years. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of jasmine tea, a habit she had maintained since our Hong Kong days. She looked tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion, a weariness that seemed to settle in her bones. "Sarah," she began in the careful English she still spoke after 25 years in America, "your father and I have been talking about the house. The mortgage payments are becoming very difficult with my medical expenses. We might need to consider selling and finding something smaller, maybe an apartment." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Sell the house where I had learned to ride a bike in the driveway, where Kevin had carved his initials into the basement door frame to mark his height each birthday, where family photos lined every wall documenting our American journey. I couldn't imagine my parents anywhere else, couldn't picture them starting over again in their 50s. "Mom," I said immediately, "don't even think about selling. I'll graduate next year and get a real job. I can help more with the payments. You and Dad have put too much into this place to give up now." She smiled sadly, patting my hand in the way she had since I was small. "You are already helping too much. You should be enjoying college, making friends, having experiences. Not worrying about your parents' bills." But I was worrying, and I had been for years. The next morning, I made a decision that would define the next several years of my life. I changed my major from computer science to information systems management, a program that offered better job prospects immediately after graduation and included internships with guaranteed pay. The coursework was less interesting to me personally, but it was more practical for our family's needs. I also started applying for every paid internship and part-time programming job I could find. My resume was thin on experience but heavy on enthusiasm and technical skills I had developed through late-night self-teaching sessions. After dozens of applications and interviews, I finally landed a part-time position with a small software company that needed someone to maintain their website and manage their social media presence. The job paid $15 an hour, significantly more than my previous positions, and I immediately started putting every extra dollar toward the mortgage. My mother protested at first, insisting that I should save money for myself, but I could see the relief in her face when the monthly financial stress began to ease slightly. My senior year passed in a blur of classes, work, and an increasingly demanding internship that had evolved into a near full-time role. The company liked my work and offered me a position after graduation with a starting salary that felt like a fortune compared to what I had been earning. I accepted immediately, not even considering other opportunities or graduate school, which had once been part of my long-term plans. After graduation, I moved back into my childhood bedroom and began what I thought would be a temporary arrangement while I saved money to eventually move out. The salary allowed me to contribute substantially to household expenses, and for the first time in years, my parents seemed to relax about money. We could afford small luxuries again, like eating out occasionally, or buying name-brand groceries without checking every price tag. Kevin, meanwhile, had graduated high school with decent grades and was accepted to several colleges. Unlike my own college search, which had been focused entirely on financial aid and practical programs, Kevin chose his school based on campus life and the strength of their basketball program. My parents didn't ask him to contribute to household expenses or work part-time during high school, and I told myself it was because they had learned from my experience and wanted him to have a more normal teenage experience. The truth was more complicated, and I knew it even then. Kevin was the baby, the son they had dreamed of, and somehow the financial pressures that had shaped my adolescence didn't seem to apply to him in the same way. When he needed money for textbooks, spring break trips, or new clothes, it was simply provided. When I had needed those same things, I had worked extra hours to pay for them myself. I stayed at home for 2 years after graduation, officially saving money but actually becoming increasingly integral to my parents' financial stability. My salary covered a significant portion of the mortgage payments, utilities, and my mother's medical expenses. I paid for groceries every week, handled car repairs when needed, and even started a small emergency savings account for the family. During this time, I also became my parents' primary liaison with the English-speaking world. I accompanied my mother to medical appointments to help communicate with doctors and insurance representatives. I handled phone calls with utility companies, managed online banking, and dealt with tax preparation. My father's English had improved significantly over the years, but complex bureaucratic language still challenged him, and my mother remained more comfortable with Mandarin in stressful situations. The arrangement felt natural and necessary, even as I watched my college friends move to different cities, start careers, get married, and begin their independent adult lives. I told myself I was being responsible, honoring my parents' sacrifices, and building a strong financial foundation before striking out on my own. When I finally did move out at 26, it was to an apartment just 15 minutes away from my parents' house. I wanted to maintain my independence, while still being available when they needed help. I continued to contribute to the household budget, though not as substantially as when I had lived at home. My mother would call me weekly with updates about neighborhood news, her garden, and requests to join them for dinner at least twice a week. Kevin graduated college and immediately moved to Los Angeles to pursue what he called opportunities in the entertainment industry. His degree in communications and his charismatic personality, he believed, would open doors in television or film production. My parents worried about him constantly, but they supported his dream with the same dedication they had shown to all of his previous pursuits. When Kevin needed money for security deposits on apartments, money for headshots and acting classes, or just help with living expenses during periods between temporary jobs, he called home. My parents, despite their own tight budget, would find ways to send him money. They justified it as an investment in his future, and I bit my tongue when they asked if I could help them cover the mortgage payment after sending Kevin another check. The dynamic frustrated me, but it also felt inevitable. I was the responsible daughter, the one who had always been reliable and financially stable. Kevin was the dreamer, the one with artistic ambitions and big plans that required support and understanding. My role was to be the safety net that allowed everyone else in the family to pursue their goals. 2 years ago, my mother's health took a turn for the worse. Her diabetes became harder to manage, requiring insulin injections and more frequent doctor visits. She also developed arthritis in her hands and knees, making her job as a teacher's aide increasingly difficult. My father, now in his early 60s, was talking about retirement but worried about their financial security without his income. I responded the way I always had, by increasing my financial contributions. I started sending money home every month to help with medical expenses, and began researching Medicare supplement plans for when my father retired. I also started visiting more frequently, helping with household tasks that were becoming difficult for my mother, and ensuring they had groceries and medications. The visits revealed that the house, now over 20 years old, needed significant repairs. The roof had developed leaks, the furnace was struggling, and the electrical system my father had upgraded years ago needed updating to modern codes. The costs were overwhelming for my parents on their reduced income, and I found myself researching contractors and getting quotes for work that would cost thousands of dollars. Last year, I made the decision to move back in with my parents, temporarily to help with my mother's care, and to save money that could be used for house repairs. It was presented as a short-term arrangement, but months stretched on without a clear timeline for when I would move out again. My mother needed help with daily tasks, my father was overwhelmed trying to manage household responsibilities while working, and I was the obvious solution to their problems. Living at home again, as an adult, brought back all the old patterns with new complications. I was contributing the majority of my salary to household expenses, managing my mother's medical appointments, and coordinating home repairs. My social life, which had been limited even when I lived independently, virtually disappeared. Friends stopped inviting me to events because I was always busy with family obligations, and dating became impossible when I was living in my childhood bedroom and spending weekends managing my parents' affairs. Kevin, meanwhile, had found some success in Los Angeles, working as a production assistant on various television shows.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His calls home were filled with excitement about industry connections and potential opportunities. He sent photos from red carpet events and talked about networking with people who could advance his career. When my parents asked when he might be able to visit, he explained that his schedule was unpredictable and travel was expensive, but he promised to come home soon. The promise never materialized. Phone calls became less frequent, usually initiated by my parents rather than by Kevin. When they did speak, Kevin was always between projects or preparing for an audition or moving to a better apartment closer to the studios. Money remained tight for him, he explained, because entertainment industry work was feast or famine, and he needed to maintain a certain image and lifestyle to be taken seriously professionally. My parents worried but made excuses for his absence. Kevin was pursuing his dreams, they said. He was young and needed to focus on building his career. They would see him when he was more established and could afford to take time off. In the meantime, they had me dependable and present and always willing to help with whatever they needed. The pattern had become so ingrained that I stopped questioning it, even when I felt resentful or exhausted. This was what family responsibility meant in our culture, I told myself. This was how I honored my parents' sacrifices and ensured their security in their golden years. If I felt trapped or if my own dreams had been postponed indefinitely, that was a small price to pay for everything they had given me. 6 months ago, my mother's arthritis progressed to the point where she had to stop working entirely. The loss of her income, though small, created new financial pressures. My father was eligible for Social Security but hadn't yet decided whether to retire fully. The house repairs could no longer be postponed, with the roof leak causing visible water damage to the ceiling in their bedroom. I took on additional freelance work in the evenings to increase my income, working on website design projects after my regular job and on weekends. The combination of full-time work, caregiving responsibilities, and freelance projects left me exhausted, but I could see how much my parents appreciated my help. My mother would thank me constantly, sometimes with tears in her eyes, for everything I was doing for them. The night before I decided to fly home for her birthday, I had been working on a client website until nearly 3 in the morning. My mother had called me earlier to say she wasn't feeling well, and I had driven over to check on her, bringing soup and staying until she felt better. When I finally got home to my apartment, I realized I hadn't been there for more than a few hours at a time in weeks. My apartment, which I was still paying rent for despite rarely sleeping there, felt like a stranger's space. Plants were dying on the windowsill, mail was piling up, and the refrigerator contained only expired condiments and takeout containers. I was paying for independence I wasn't actually experiencing, working constantly to support a family structure that left me feeling increasingly isolated and exhausted. That's when I remembered my mother's birthday was coming up and realized I hadn't been present for any family celebrations in months. Even when I was physically there, I was usually handling logistics, managing details, or solving problems rather than simply enjoying time with my parents. I missed the version of our family that had existed before financial stress and health problems had turned every interaction into a crisis management session. The idea of surprising my mother with a visit, of recapturing some of the joy and spontaneity that had been missing from our relationship, felt suddenly urgent. I wanted to see her face light up with genuine happiness rather than relief at my arrival to help with something difficult. I wanted to remember why I loved her beyond the obligations that had come to define our relationship. I booked the flight impulsively, using money I should have saved for the next month's mortgage contribution. It felt rebellious and selfish and necessary all at once. For once I was going to do something purely for emotional reasons rather than practical ones. I was going to surprise my mother, spend time with my family without an agenda or a problem to solve, and maybe remember what it felt like to be a daughter rather than a caregiver and financial supporter. The 12-hour flight gave me time to imagine her reaction, to plan all the things we would do together during my visit. I pictured us cooking in the kitchen where we had shared so many conversations, talking about something other than medical appointments or home repairs. I imagined sitting in the garden she had tended for 20 years, hearing about her latest plantings and sharing updates about my life beyond the logistical details that usually dominated our phone calls. I even allowed myself to hope that Kevin might somehow be there, that maybe he had planned his own surprise visit and we could have one of those perfect family moments that had become so rare in recent years. The fantasy sustained me through the uncomfortable flight, the long security lines, and the expensive taxi ride from the airport to what I still thought of as home. Standing on the sidewalk in front of 1247 Maple Street, staring at strangers unpacking boxes from a moving truck, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. 20 years of assumption, of taking for granted that home would always be there, of believing that my sacrifices were preserving something permanent and precious, crumbled in an instant. The Asian woman directing the movers looked at me with polite concern when she noticed me standing there with my suitcase, clearly confused and lost. She approached me with the kind of cautious kindness you show to someone who appears to be having a breakdown in public. "Excuse me," she said gently, "can I help you with something? You look lost." I opened my mouth to explain that this was my house, that there had been some mistake, that my parents lived here and I was just visiting for my mother's birthday. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I heard myself ask a question that I already knew the answer to. "The people who lived here before, the Chens, do you know where they moved?" She nodded sympathetically. "Oh yes, the previous owners were very nice. They moved about 2 months ago. I think the real estate agent mentioned they downsized to a condominium complex on the other side of town. Something about wanting something smaller and easier to maintain. 2 months ago, my mother's birthday was today, which meant they had sold the house just after her previous birthday, just after I had sent money for what I thought were routine house repairs and medical expenses. 2 months of phone calls where she had mentioned neighbors and garden updates and never once indicated that they no longer lived in the house I had been working to help them keep for my entire adult life. I thanked the woman and walked back to the sidewalk, pulling out my phone to call my mother. My hands were shaking as I dialed, and I realized I wasn't sure what I was going to say. How do you ask your parents why they forgot to mention they no longer live in the house you thought you were helping them save? The phone rang 4 times before she answered, her voice bright with the particular happiness she always showed when I called unexpectedly. "Sarah," she said warmly, "what a nice surprise. I was just thinking about you. How was your day at work?" "Mom," I said slowly, "I'm standing in front of the house on Maple Street, but you're not here. There are strangers living here now." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long, I wondered if the call had been dropped. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and careful in a way I had never heard before. "Oh Sarah, oh no, you came home." The weight of those 4 words, the resigned sadness and dawning horror in her voice, told me everything I needed to know about how drastically my understanding of my family's situation had been wrong. The conversation that followed was one of the most painful of my life. My mother's voice cracked as she tried to explain, her words tumbling out in a mixture of English and Mandarin the way they always did when she was overwhelmed. She told me they had moved to Sunset Gardens, a retirement community about 20 minutes across town. The house had become too much to manage, she said, too expensive to maintain, too big for just the 2 of them now that their health was declining. "But Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I've been sending money every month to help with the mortgage. I've been working extra hours to pay for the roof repairs and the furnace. Why didn't you tell me you were selling?" The silence stretched again before she whispered, "We wanted to tell you but we didn't know how. You were working so hard, doing so much for us. We couldn't bear to tell you that all your sacrifices weren't enough to save the house." Her words hit me like a physical blow. All my sacrifices weren't enough. Years of delayed dreams, postponed relationships, and financial stress had been for nothing. The house I thought I was helping to preserve was gone, sold while I continued to send money for a mortgage that no longer existed. "Where is the money going now?" I asked quietly. "The money I send every month. We put it in savings," she admitted. "We wanted to give it back to you when you were ready to buy your own place, but you never talked about moving out permanently or getting married or having children. We thought maybe you were happy living with us and helping us." The assumption stung. They had decided I was content to sacrifice my independence indefinitely, that I had no dreams or desires beyond caring for them. It had never occurred to them to ask what I wanted or to involve me in the decision to sell the house that had shaped so much of my identity. "I'm coming to see you," I told her. "What's the address of your new place?" "Sarah, maybe you should wait. Come another time when we can prepare, when we can explain everything properly." "No," I said firmly, I flew 12 hours to see you on your birthday. I want to see where you live now." The taxi ride to Sunset Gardens gave me time to process what I had learned, but understanding felt impossible. My parents had made a major life decision without consulting me, despite the fact that I had been their primary financial supporter for years. They had allowed me to continue working myself to exhaustion to pay for expenses that no longer existed, assuming I was happy to sacrifice my own future indefinitely. Sunset Gardens was a sprawling complex of low-rise buildings surrounded by well-maintained gardens and walking paths. It looked pleasant enough, designed for active seniors who wanted community and convenience without the responsibilities of home ownership. As the taxi pulled up to Building C, I could see my mother waiting by the entrance, wringing her hands nervously. She looked smaller than I remembered, more fragile. The move, the stress of hiding this secret, and her ongoing health issues had aged her visibly. When she saw me getting out of the taxi with my suitcase, her face crumpled and she started crying before I even reached her. "I'm so sorry," she kept repeating as she led me through the lobby. "We never meant for you to find out this way. We never meant to hurt you." Their new apartment was a fraction of the size of the house on Maple Street. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a combined living and dining area, and a small kitchenette. It was clean and modern, with new carpet and updated fixtures, but it felt sterile compared to the home where I had grown up. None of the familiar furniture fit properly in the smaller space, and boxes were still stacked in corners, suggesting they were still settling in months after the move. My father emerged from one of the bedrooms, his face grave with shame and worry.
"Sarah," he said simply, then stopped as if he didn't know what words could possibly make this situation better. We sat in their cramped living room, and the full story slowly emerged. The house repairs had been more extensive than they had initially revealed. The roof needed complete replacement, not just patching. The electrical system was so outdated it posed a fire hazard. The furnace was beyond repair and needed replacement. The foundation had developed cracks that required professional attention. The estimates they had received totaled nearly $60,000, far beyond what they could afford even with my contributions. Their insurance would cover some of the damage but not the underlying structural issues that had caused it. They had consulted with a financial advisor who suggested that selling the house and moving to a retirement community would be their best option for long-term financial security. The sale had closed 2 months ago, and after paying off the remaining mortgage and closing costs, they had a modest nest egg that would supplement their Social Security and help cover medical expenses in the coming years. The monthly fees at Sunset Gardens included utilities, maintenance, and access to healthcare services, removing the financial uncertainty that had plagued them in recent years. "But why didn't you tell me?" I asked again. "Why let me keep sending money for expenses that didn't exist anymore?" "Your father wanted to tell you right away," my mother said, glancing at him apologetically. "But I was afraid you would think we didn't appreciate everything you had done for us. Afraid you would be angry that your hard work hadn't been enough to save the house. Afraid you would stop visiting if you didn't feel needed anymore." The last reason revealed a truth I hadn't fully understood before. My parents had come to depend not just on my financial support, but on my presence in their lives. They were terrified that without the shared burden of the house and their expenses, I would drift away from them the way Kevin had. They had kept me financially entangled because they feared losing me emotionally. I felt a complex mixture of anger, sadness, and something that might have been relief. The house was gone, the symbol of everything I thought I had been working to preserve. But my parents were safe, financially stable for the first time in years, and living in a community where they had access to healthcare and social activities. In many ways, this outcome was better for them than struggling to maintain an aging house with mounting repair costs. The anger came from the deception, from months of continuing to send money and work extra hours while they watched me sacrifice my own financial security for expenses that no longer existed. The sadness was for the loss of the house itself, for the childhood home where so many memories had been made, for the symbol of my parents' American dream that was now owned by strangers. The relief, which surprised me, was the realization that I was no longer responsible for maintaining a house that had been falling apart faster than we could repair it. I no longer had to worry about my parents being unable to afford mortgage payments or facing foreclosure in their retirement years. The burden I had carried for so long had been lifted,
but without my knowledge or consent. That evening, we had a quiet dinner in their small dining area. My mother had prepared my favorite dishes, the same ones she used to make for special occasions in the house on Maple Street. But everything felt different in this new space, like we were playing house in someone else's home rather than sharing a family meal. The conversation was stilted, full of carefully avoided topics and unspoken tensions. My parents kept apologizing, and I kept reassuring them that I understood their reasoning while internally struggling to process the implications of what they had done. We were all trying to act normal while acknowledging that our family dynamic had been fundamentally altered by their secret. After dinner, my father showed me around the complex, pointing out amenities like the fitness center, library, and community room where they hosted social events. He seemed proud of these features, like he was trying to sell me on the benefits of their new living situation. But I could sense his underlying anxiety about my reaction, his fear that I was judging them for giving up the house that had meant so much to our family. Several of their neighbors stopped to chat as we walked, welcoming me warmly and commenting on how much my parents talked about me. They seemed to have integrated well into the community, making friends and participating in activities. My mother had joined a gardening club that maintained flower beds around the complex, and my father was helping with maintenance projects that utilized his electrical skills. Seeing them in this environment, I realized they were probably happier and more relaxed than they had been in years. The constant stress of home maintenance, property taxes, and repair costs had been replaced by predictable monthly fees and professional management. They had neighbors their own age and access to healthcare services on site. For their stage of life, this was likely a better choice than trying to age in place in a house that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. But they had made this decision without consulting me, despite my years of financial contributions and emotional investment in their well-being. They had assumed they knew what was best for everyone, without considering how their choices would affect my own financial planning or life decisions. The paternalistic nature of their decision-making frustrated me as much as the secrecy itself. That night, sleeping on their pull-out couch in the cramped living room, I stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of everything that had happened. I had spent my entire adult life organizing my priorities around my parents' needs, and they had reorganized their entire living situation without including me in the discussion. The asymmetry of our relationship had never been more apparent. I thought about the apartment I was still paying rent for, the one I barely lived in because I was always helping my parents or working to earn money to send them. I thought about the social life I had abandoned, the career opportunities I had passed up because they required travel or longer hours that would interfere with my family obligations. I thought about the relationships that had ended because I never had time or emotional energy to invest in them properly. All of those sacrifices had been made to support a lifestyle my parents had already decided to abandon. They had been planning their exit strategy while I was doubling down on my commitment to their previous life. The disconnect was almost surreal in its completeness. The next morning, my mother's actual birthday, she woke up early to make breakfast as if this were any normal visit. She prepared all my favorite foods, just as she had done for every celebration throughout my childhood. But when she handed me a cup of coffee, her hands were shaking slightly, and I could see the anxiety in her eyes. "Happy birthday, Mom," I said, giving her a hug that felt different from all the ones that had come before. It was loving but also guarded, affectionate but cautious. "Thank you for coming all this way to see me," she replied. "I know this isn't what you expected to find. We need to talk about what happens next," I said gently. "About the money I've been sending, about my living situation, about everything." My father joined us at the small table, and we had the conversation that should have happened months ago. They explained their finances in detail for the first time, showing me bank statements and retirement account balances. They were actually in better financial shape than they had been in years, with the proceeds from the house sale providing security they had never enjoyed as homeowners. The money I had been sending was sitting in a savings account, untouched except for the guilt my mother felt every time she made a deposit. They had been afraid to spend it because it felt like taking advantage of my generosity under false pretenses. They had also been afraid to return it because that would require explaining why it was no longer needed. "I want to pause the monthly payments immediately," I said, "and I want to move back into my apartment full-time."
I think we all need some space to figure out what our relationship looks like when it's not built around crisis management and financial dependence. The relief on their faces was unmistakable, though they tried to hide it. They had been as trapped by our codependent dynamic as I had been, unable to enjoy their newfound financial stability because they were constantly aware of the sacrifices I was making on their behalf. But what about your visits? My mother asked anxiously. What about family dinners and helping us with appointments and paperwork? I'll still visit regularly, I promised. I'll still help when you need me. But I need to have my own life too. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not primarily defined by being your daughter and caregiver. The conversation was painful but necessary. We spent the rest of the day talking about boundaries, expectations, and the changes we all needed to make to create a healthier family dynamic. It was exhausting and emotional, but it was also the most honest communication we had shared in years. My mother seemed to age visibly as we talked, the weight of her secret and her fears finally being released. She had been carrying tremendous guilt about the deception, worrying constantly about my reaction when I eventually discovered the truth. She had also been grieving the loss of the house and the life it represented, but had been unable to express that grief because she was supposed to be happy about their improved circumstances. My father characteristically focused on practical matters. He wanted to understand the financial implications of stopping my monthly contributions to make sure they could manage their expenses independently. He also wanted to return the money they had saved, seeing it as rightfully mine since it had been earned through my extra work and sacrifices. I declined the money, at least for now. They should keep it as an emergency fund, I explained, since they were still adjusting to retirement and their health needs might change unpredictably. But I wanted transparency about their finances going forward, and I wanted them to communicate with me before making major decisions that affected our family. As the day progressed, we began to relax into a version of our relationship that felt more honest, if unfamiliar. My mother showed me photos of the friends she had made at Sunset Gardens, the activities she was enjoying, and the small garden plot she was cultivating in the community space. She seemed lighter, more animated than I had seen her in months. My father talked about the volunteer work he was doing with the maintenance team, using his skills to help other residents with electrical problems and minor repairs. He was proud of being useful in a way that didn't require the physical strain of maintaining an entire property. He was also sleeping better, no longer waking up worried about mortgage payments or expensive repairs. Their contentment with their new life made me realize how much stress the house had been causing all of us, even though none of us had been willing to admit it at the time. They were healthier and happier in their retirement community, even if the transition had been handled poorly from a communication standpoint. But I was still processing the implications for my own life. I had spent years defining myself as the responsible daughter, the one who put family needs before personal desires. Without the constant financial pressures and caregiving responsibilities, who was I supposed to be? The question was both exciting and terrifying. That evening we had dinner at the community dining room, a spacious area where residents could eat together if they chose. My parents introduced me to their neighbors, and I could see how well they had integrated into this new social environment. People knew them, liked them, and included them in conversations about community events and shared interests. Watching my parents interact with their peers, I realized they had been socially isolated in the house on Maple Street in ways I hadn't fully appreciated. Their old neighborhood had changed over the years, with younger families moving in who didn't share languages or cultural backgrounds with my parents. Here they were surrounded by people in similar life stages, dealing with similar challenges. One of their friends, a woman named Margaret, pulled me aside during dinner to tell me how much my parents talked about me. "They're so proud of everything you've accomplished," she said warmly. "And they worry that they've asked too much of you over the years. They just want you to be happy." The comment stayed with me as I prepared to leave the next day. My parents had been carrying guilt about my sacrifices, just as I had been carrying resentment about their expectations. We had all been trapped in a dynamic that served no one's best interests, sustained by love and obligation in equal measure. My father drove me to the airport in his car, which looked enormous in the small parking space at their new complex. During the drive, he talked about practical matters like changing the address on their insurance policies and updating their emergency contacts.
But as we pulled up to the departure terminal, he turned to me with an expression of profound regret. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I failed you. I let you carry burdens that weren't yours to carry, and I didn't protect your right to have your own life and dreams. I'm sorry it took losing the house for me to see how unfair we had been to you." His apology meant more to me than he could have known. It acknowledged not just the recent deception, but the years of assumptions and expectations that had shaped our relationship. It recognized my sacrifices while also freeing me from the obligation to continue making them indefinitely. The flight home gave me 12 hours to process everything that had happened and to begin imagining what my life might look like with my newfound freedom. I could move back into my apartment full-time, pursue social relationships I had been too busy to maintain, maybe even consider career opportunities that required more time and energy than I had previously been able to commit. But I also had to confront the reality that I had spent my adult life defining myself in relationship to other people's needs. Without the constant demands of caregiving and financial support, I wasn't entirely sure who I was or what I wanted. The prospect of discovering my own desires and ambitions was both exhilarating and overwhelming. As the plane descended into Seattle, I looked out the window at the city where I had been born and raised, where my parents had built their American dream, and where I was finally free to build my own life on my own terms. The house on Maple Street was gone, sold to strangers who would create their own memories in its rooms. But maybe that was okay. Maybe it was time for all of us to stop living in the past and start building something new. 3 weeks after returning from my parents' place, I was sitting in my own apartment for the first time in months, really looking around at the space I had been paying for but not inhabiting. The plants on the windowsill were beyond saving, brown and brittle from neglect. Dust-covered surfaces I hadn't touched in ages. Mail was stacked on the counter, most of it bills and promotional materials that felt irrelevant to the life I had actually been living. But for the first time the silence felt peaceful rather than lonely. I wasn't waiting for a phone call about a medical emergency or a home repair crisis. I wasn't calculating how many extra hours I needed to work to cover unexpected expenses. I was simply present in my own space with no immediate obligations to anyone but myself. The feeling was so unfamiliar it almost made me anxious. I found myself checking my phone constantly, expecting urgent messages that never came. My parents were settling into their routine at Sunset Gardens, and our communication had shifted to planned weekly calls, rather than the daily crisis management conversations that had defined our relationship for years. During our first scheduled call, my mother sounded different. More relaxed, less burdened by guilt and worry. She told me about a cooking class she had joined and a book club that was reading novels by Asian American authors. My father had started teaching basic electrical safety to other residents and was proud of being useful without the physical strain of maintaining an entire property. They asked about my week, and for the first time in years, I had things to talk about that weren't related to helping them. I had gone to a movie with a coworker. I had reorganized my apartment. I had started researching graduate programs and user experience design, something I had always been interested in but never had time to pursue. The conversation felt lighter, more like the relationship I remembered from my childhood before financial stress and health problems had made every interaction feel urgent and weighty. We were rediscovering how to simply enjoy each other's company rather than constantly managing logistics and crises. But the adjustment wasn't entirely smooth. I found myself struggling with identity questions I had never had to confront before. Who was I when I wasn't primarily defined as the responsible daughter and family caregiver? What did I actually want from my own life when I wasn't organizing it around other people's needs? I started therapy, something I had always claimed I was too busy for but that suddenly felt essential. My therapist, Dr. Martinez, helped me understand that my sense of self had become so intertwined with being needed by my family that I had never developed a strong sense of my own desires and boundaries. During one session, she asked me to describe what I wanted my life to look like in 5 years. I sat in silence for several minutes, realizing I had no idea. All of my long-term thinking had been focused on my parents' needs, their health, their housing, their financial security. I had never allowed myself to imagine a future that was primarily about my own goals and dreams. The exercise was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. I could pursue further education, travel, relationships, career changes, creative projects. But I had no practice making decisions based purely on my own preferences rather than practical considerations about how my choices would affect my ability to support my family. I started small, with decisions that felt manageable but personally meaningful. I redecorated my apartment, choosing colors and furniture that I actually liked rather than the neutral, practical options I had selected years ago. I joined a hiking group, something I had always enjoyed but hadn't made time for in years. I started cooking elaborate meals for myself, experimenting with recipes that interested me rather than the quick, efficient options I had relied on when I was constantly rushing between obligations. Each choice felt like a small act of rebellion against the version of myself I had been for so long. I was learning to prioritize my own preferences and to believe that my personal happiness was valuable in itself, not just as a byproduct of fulfilling responsibilities to others. About a month after my visit, Kevin called me unexpectedly. It was the first direct conversation we had shared in over a year, and his voice sounded strained in a way that immediately put me on alert. "Sarah," he began hesitantly, "Mom and Dad told me about what happened when you went to visit. About the house and everything. I feel terrible that I wasn't there to help with any of it." His words surprised me. I had assumed Kevin was oblivious to the family dynamics that had shaped my adult life, too focused on his own career and social life to notice the sacrifices I had been making. But he continued talking, and I realized he had been more aware than I had given him credit for. "I know I've been selfish," he said quietly. "I know you've been carrying all the responsibility for Mom and Dad while I've been out here pursuing my dreams. I kept telling myself I would help more once I got established, but the truth is, I was relieved that you were handling everything so I didn't have to." The admission was both validating and painful. It confirmed what I had suspected but had never heard acknowledged directly. Kevin had been able to pursue his ambitions freely because he knew I would take care of our parents' needs. He had benefited from my sense of obligation while remaining distant from its costs. But I also heard genuine remorse in his voice, and a desire to change the dynamic that had defined our family roles for so long. He told me he had been successful enough in his work to start contributing financially to our parents' support, and he wanted to take over the monthly payments I had been making. "I don't need the money anymore," I explained. "They're financially stable now, and they were saving what I sent anyway. But they do need emotional support and regular contact. They miss you, Kevin." He was quiet for a long moment before admitting that he had been avoiding visits because he felt guilty about how little he had contributed to their care over the years. The longer he stayed away, the harder it became to face the reality of how much I had been doing in his absence. We talked for over an hour, having the most honest conversation about our family that we had ever shared. Kevin acknowledged the unfairness of the burden I had carried, and I admitted my resentment about his absence during our parents' most difficult years. But we also began to talk about how we could both be more present in their lives going forward, sharing responsibilities in ways that honored both our capabilities and our individual life goals. By the end of the call, we had agreed that Kevin would visit our parents within the next month and would commit to regular phone calls and planned visits going forward. I would continue to handle their medical appointments and local emergencies when needed, but Kevin would take on other types of support like technology help and social visits. The conversation marked a turning point in my relationship with my brother, but it also represented something larger. My family was finally acknowledging the dysfunction in our previous dynamic and actively working to create something healthier and more equitable. 2 months after my surprise visit, I made a decision that would have been impossible when I was trapped in the cycle of constant caregiving and financial support. I applied to a master's program in user experience design at the University of Washington, something I had been interested in for years but had never pursued, because it would require time and mental energy I hadn't felt able to spare. The application process itself was a revelation. Writing personal statements about my goals and interests, requesting recommendation letters that highlighted my professional achievements, researching professors whose work excited me intellectually. I was engaging with my own ambitions in a way I hadn't done since college, before family obligations had consumed my attention so completely. When I called to tell my parents about my decision to apply for graduate school, their reaction surprised me. Instead of worry about how I would balance studies with helping them, they were genuinely excited about my academic and professional development. My mother, in particular, seemed proud in a way that felt different from her previous expressions of appreciation for my sacrifices. This pride was about my individual accomplishments and potential rather than my willingness to put their needs first. It felt like she was seeing me as a complete person with my own dreams, rather than primarily as their devoted daughter. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had been accepted into the program with a partial fellowship that would help cover tuition costs. For the first time in years, I had something to celebrate that was entirely my own achievement, unrelated to solving someone else's problems or meeting family obligations. I called my parents to share the news, and their joy was infectious. My father immediately started researching the program online, wanting to understand what I would be studying. My mother began planning a celebration dinner, insisting that this accomplishment deserved proper recognition. But the most meaningful response came from Kevin, who called that evening to congratulate me. He had been planning a visit to Seattle anyway, he said, but now he wanted to make it a celebration of my acceptance. For the first time in our adult lives, he was prioritizing a family event that was focused on my achievements rather than on crisis management or obligation. The celebration dinner took place at a restaurant near my parents' new complex, a place they had discovered and wanted to share with me. It was casual and comfortable, nothing fancy, but it felt significant because it represented our new normal. We were together by choice, celebrating positive news, focused on the future rather than managing immediate problems. During dinner, my father raised his glass and made a toast that brought tears to my eyes. To Sarah, he said, who has taught us all what it means to be both loyal to family and true to yourself. We are proud of the woman you have become and excited to see what you will accomplish next. The words acknowledged both my years of sacrifice and my right to pursue my own dreams. It was the kind of validation I had craved for so long, but receiving it now felt different because I no longer needed it to know my own worth. The approval was meaningful because it came from people I loved, not because it was essential to my sense of self. Kevin surprised me by presenting a small gift, a leather portfolio for my graduate school applications and future academic work. Inside, he had written a note apologizing for his absence during the difficult years and expressing his commitment to being more present going forward. As we sat around the table, laughing and talking about my plans for graduate school, I realized we had achieved something I hadn't thought possible. We were still a family, still connected by love and shared history, but we were also individuals with our own lives and dreams. The crisis that had brought us together in crisis management mode had finally ended, allowing us to discover what our relationships could be when they weren't defined by constant need and obligation. The meal ended with my parents insisting on paying the bill, despite my protests. It was their way of reversing the financial dynamic that had characterized our relationship for so long. For once, they were treating me rather than the other way around. As I drove home to my apartment, I reflected on how much had changed in just a few months. The shock of discovering they had sold the house without telling me had initially felt like a betrayal, but it had ultimately freed all of us from unsustainable patterns that were serving no one well. My parents were healthier and happier in their retirement community, surrounded by peers and free from the financial stress of homeownership. Kevin was finally taking responsibility for his share of family relationships, visiting and calling regularly. I was pursuing my own dreams while maintaining loving connections with both of them. The house on Maple Street was gone, sold to a young family who would create their own memories in its rooms. But maybe that was appropriate. The dreams that house had represented, the struggles it had symbolized, belonged to a different chapter of our family story. We were all writing new chapters now, individually and together. Starting graduate school that fall felt like stepping into a life I had almost forgotten was possible. I was surrounded by classmates who were passionate about design and technology, professors who challenged me intellectually, and projects that excited my creativity. I was finally using my mind in ways that fulfilled me personally, rather than just solving practical problems for other people. The program was demanding, requiring late nights and weekend work that reminded me of my college years. But this time, the effort felt different because it was directed toward my own goals rather than toward maintaining financial stability for my family. My parents adapted to my busier schedule with understanding rather than resentment. They had their own full lives at Sunset Gardens, with activities and friendships that didn't depend on my constant availability. When we did spend time together, it was because we genuinely enjoyed each other's company, rather than because of crisis or obligation. Kevin made good on his promise to visit regularly, and his relationship with our parents deepened in ways that surprised all of us. He brought energy and humor to their lives, sharing stories about his work and asking about their activities and interests. He also helped them navigate technology challenges, and occasionally took them on outings around Seattle. The balance we had achieved wasn't perfect, and it required ongoing communication and adjustment, but it was sustainable in a way our previous dynamic had never been. We all had our own lives while still maintaining meaningful family connections. Looking back on that day when I stood in front of strangers unpacking their belongings in what I had thought was my childhood home, I realize it was one of the most important moments of my adult life. The shock and hurt had been genuine, but they had also been catalysts for conversations and changes that had been necessary for years. Sometimes the people who love us most can trap us in roles that limit our growth, not out of malice but out of their own fears and needs. Sometimes standing up for your right to have your own life requires disappointing people you care about, at least temporarily. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your family is to refuse to sacrifice yourself indefinitely for their comfort. I learned that being a good daughter doesn't require martyring your own dreams, and that taking care of yourself isn't selfish when it allows you to show up more fully in all your relationships. The guilt I had carried about pursuing my own interests finally began to fade when I saw how much happier and healthier everyone became when we stopped enabling each other's dysfunction. If you're watching this and feeling trapped by family expectations or obligations that seem to have no end, know that it's possible to love your family while also insisting on your right to have your own life. It's possible to be supportive without being self-sacrificing. It's possible to change patterns that have existed for years, even when it feels scary and uncertain. The house on Maple Street will always be part of my story, but it's no longer the center of it. I'm the center of my own story now, and that makes me a better daughter, sister, and person than I ever was when I was trying to save everyone else at the expense of myself. 5 years have passed since that shocking day when I discovered strangers living in what I thought was my childhood home. I'm now 33, holding a master's degree in user experience design and working as a senior designer at a tech company that values both innovation and work-life balance. The girl who once defined herself entirely through family obligations has become a woman who knows her own worth and guards her personal boundaries carefully. Last month I bought my first house. Not a condo or starter apartment, but an actual house with a yard and space for the art studio I've always wanted. When I called my parents to share the news, their excitement was genuine and uncomplicated. No worry about whether I could afford it, no concern about how homeownership might affect my availability to help them. Just pure joy for my achievement and curiosity about my plans for the space. The house hunting process itself had been revelatory. I found myself drawn to properties with character and charm, rather than the practical, sensible options I might have chosen years ago. I wanted hardwood floors that creaked with history, built-in bookshelves that suggested cozy reading nooks, and a kitchen island where friends could gather while I cooked elaborate meals just because I enjoyed doing it. When the realtor asked about my must-haves and deal-breakers, I realized I had never been asked to articulate my personal preferences about something so significant. For most of my adult life, major decisions had been filtered through questions of practicality and family impact rather than personal desire. But here I was, choosing crown molding over updated fixtures and a reading nook over a formal dining room, simply because they brought me joy. The closing process coincided with my parents' 5th anniversary at Sunset Gardens. They had not only adapted to retirement community life, but had become community leaders, organizing social events and representing residents' interests with management. My mother served on the gardening committee and had started a Mandarin conversation group for the handful of Chinese residents. My father taught monthly electrical safety workshops and had been elected to the residents' council. Their contentment with this phase of their lives had deepened over the years, and their pride in their independence was evident every time we spoke. They had friends, activities, and a sense of purpose that didn't depend on being needed by their children. The guilt they had initially felt about no longer requiring my financial support had transformed into satisfaction at being able to manage their own affairs, while still enjoying close relationships with Kevin and me. Kevin had surprised everyone, including himself, by becoming not just a more present son, but a genuinely thoughtful and reliable family member. His visits were now planned months in advance and had become highlights of our parents' social calendar. He brought energy and humor to their lives, while also providing practical help with technology and occasional outings to restaurants or cultural events they wouldn't have explored on their own. His career in Los Angeles had stabilized into steady work as a production coordinator for a television network, a job that offered more security and predictable schedules than his previous freelance projects. The stability had allowed him to become more generous with both his time and financial contributions to family expenses when needed. More importantly, he had developed genuine relationships with our parents based on mutual interest and affection, rather than obligation or crisis management. The dynamic between Kevin and me had also evolved significantly. We now spoke regularly, sharing updates about our work and personal lives, without the underlying tension that had characterized our previous interactions. I no longer felt resentful about his past absence, and he no longer felt defensive about his career choices. We had found ways to both be present in our parents' lives while pursuing our individual goals and interests. During my housewarming party, a small gathering of friends and family in my new living room, I watched my parents interacting easily with my coworkers and friends. They asked thoughtful questions about my work, shared stories about their activities at Sunset Gardens, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know the people who had become important to me. They were no longer just my parents who needed care and support. They were individuals with their own perspectives and experiences to contribute to conversations. One of my friends, Maria, pulled me aside during the party to comment on how relaxed and happy my family seemed together. She had heard snippets of my story over the years, and had expected more tension or awkwardness given our complicated history. Instead, she observed genuine affection and respect between all of us, the kind of family dynamic she had always wished for in her own relationships. The observation made me realize how far we had all come from the crisis-driven interactions that had defined our relationships for so long. We were choosing to spend time together because we enjoyed each other's company, not because someone needed emergency help or financial assistance. The conversations flowed naturally between topics of mutual interest, rather than focusing exclusively on medical updates or household problems. Later that evening, after the guests had left and I was cleaning up with Kevin's help while our parents rested in the living room, my mother approached me with a small wrapped gift. Inside was a framed photo of the house on Maple Street, taken during one of our family barbecues when I was in high school. In the picture, I'm helping serve food while Kevin and my father play catch in the background, and my mother tends to vegetables on the grill. "I thought you might want this for your new house," she said quietly. "Not to remember the sadness, but to remember the good times we had as a family. That house was special to all of us, even though letting it go was the right decision." The gift was thoughtful and healing in ways I hadn't expected. For years, I had associated the Maple Street house with sacrifice and financial stress, with my parents' failure to recognize my contributions and include me in major decisions. But looking at the photo, I could also see the love and connection that had existed alongside the dysfunction. The house had been the setting for genuine family moments, even if it had also become a symbol of unhealthy patterns we needed to break. I placed the photo on my mantle next to pictures from recent family gatherings and milestones I had achieved since reclaiming my independence. The old and new images together told a more complete story than either could tell alone. Our family's journey had included both painful mistakes and genuine love, financial stress and eventual stability, dysfunction and growth. That night, alone in my new house for the first time, I walked through the rooms and imagined the life I would build in this space. I pictured dinner parties with friends, quiet evenings reading by the fireplace, projects in the art studio I was planning to set up in the spare bedroom.
I imagined holiday gatherings where my parents would be guests in my home, rather than hosts managing elaborate preparations. The independence I had fought for, and finally achieved, felt different from what I had expected during those difficult early months of establishing boundaries and rebuilding relationships. It wasn't the lonely freedom I had sometimes feared it might be, but rather a secure foundation from which I could choose my connections and commitments based on genuine desire rather than obligation or crisis. I had also discovered that being a good daughter didn't require sacrificing my own dreams, and that loving my family deeply was completely compatible with having my own life and priorities. The false choice I had perceived for so many years between family loyalty and personal fulfillment had been just that, false. The healthiest family relationships were built on mutual respect and individual wholeness rather than codependence and self-sacrifice. The lessons I had learned extended beyond family dynamics to all areas of my life. At work, I no longer volunteered for every extra project or stayed late to cover for colleagues who hadn't managed their time well. In friendships, I was honest about my availability and needs, rather than always deferring to others' preferences. In romantic relationships, I looked for partners who valued my independence and supported my goals rather than expecting me to organize my life around theirs. The changes hadn't always been easy or comfortable. Learning to disappoint people sometimes, to prioritize my own needs, and to trust that relationships could survive conflicts and boundary setting had required practice and courage. But the payoff had been immense. I was surrounded by people who knew and valued the real me rather than a version of myself constructed primarily to meet others' expectations. On my 33rd birthday, exactly 10 years after my college graduation, and the devastating conversation that had initially crushed my dreams of partnership in the family restaurant business, from my inspiration store, my family gathered in my new house for the first celebration that was purely about me and longer than I could remember. There was no crisis to manage, no financial stress to navigate, no underlying tension about unmet obligations. My parents brought homemade dishes from recipes they had perfected at Sunset Gardens cooking classes. Kevin arrived with flowers and a bottle of wine he had chosen specifically because he remembered me mentioning I wanted to learn more about varietals. The gifts were thoughtful rather than practical, chosen to reflect my interests and personality rather than needs or responsibilities. During dinner, the conversation ranged from my latest work projects to Kevin's upcoming promotion to our parents' plans for a cruise they were taking with friends from their community. We talked about books we had read, movies we had enjoyed, and places we wanted to travel. We were relating to each other as complete individuals with diverse interests rather than family members defined primarily by our roles and obligations to each other. As I blew out the candles on my birthday cake, I made a wish that had nothing to do with anyone else's needs or problems. I wished for continued growth in my career, for creative fulfillment in my art projects, for meaningful relationships that enriched my life, and for the wisdom to keep choosing authenticity over approval in all my decisions. The journey from that devastating day when I discovered my parents had sold our family home without telling me to this moment of genuine celebration had been longer and more complex than I could have imagined. But it had been worth every difficult conversation, every moment of uncertainty, and every choice to prioritize long-term health over short-term comfort. Standing in my own house, surrounded by family members who now saw and valued me as a complete person, I realized that the home I had thought I was losing on Maple Street had never really been about the building itself. It had been about feeling known, valued, and secure in my relationships. That sense of home had followed me here, stronger and more authentic than it had ever been when it was built on obligation rather than mutual respect and genuine affection. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.